Hello.
Hello.
Welcome, everyone. Hello, Judith. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jen Costa, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you all to the library's online author event tonight. I'm very excited to be able to talk with the wonderful writer Judith Hoare, who has written this fabulous biography, The Woman Who Cracked the Anxiety Code, The Extraordinary Life of Dr. Claire Weekes. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung and the Eastern Ma original owners of the lands on which this library service operates, and the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, and I pay our respects to the Wadawurrung and Eastern Ma elders, past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and celebrate the First Nations people of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. A few brief housekeeping reminders before we begin. So if you want to participate towards the end of the live webinar, you can click the Q&A button, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Some of you may need to touch the screen to have the Q&A come up, and you can type your questions in. And I can ask Judith those questions towards the end of tonight's session. The webinar is also being recorded, so if you'd like to watch the discussion again or recommend it to family and friends, it will be uploaded to the library's YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So that's pretty exciting that we can do that, the wonders of modern technology. Before we begin our discussion, a little bit of background about myself. I am an author, and my two books, my best-selling author of Judith Hoare, the biography of a bestseller, and also Judith Hoare's Regency World, an illustrated guide to the world of the English Regency, both published by Random House UK and Source Books in the US. And in 2015, I had the very great thrill of joining Stephen Fry in unveiling an English Heritage Blue Plaque to Judith Hoare on her home in Wimbledon. I've since written several other books and am working on new manuscripts at the moment. I also have done 12 really interesting radio interviews with local Australian authors, which are on my website if you're interested. Tonight, I'm really delighted to have been invited to facilitate this event with Judith Hoare. Judith is a journalist who has worked for the ABC and the Australian Financial Review over several decades, a very eminent and accomplished journalist. She shifted to features writing and to eventually specialise in editing long-form journalism for the Fin Review. And she was appointed deputy editor in 1995 and held that position for 20 years, so which is pretty fabulous. I don't know why my phone is ringing, sorry. Tonight, Judith will be discussing her book, The Woman Who Cracked the Anxiety Code, which tells the true story. Sorry, people. So this wonderful book, The Woman Who Cracked the Anxiety Code, tells the true story of the little-known mental health pioneer, Dr. Claire Weekes, an Australian who revolutionised how we see the defining problem of our era, anxiety. And could there be a more relevant discussion than perhaps this one? Because here are so many of us in lockdown, and I know that there is anxiety out there. So I think this is going to be a really fascinating discussion. So I'd like to begin, Judith, by talking to you, asking you about your book and what it was that actually prompted you. What brought you to Claire Weekes?
Well, I tripped across her work quite serendipitously when I was in Canberra. I was in my 20s. And I was working in the Canberra Press Gallery, covering politics. It was really exciting. It was my dream to cover politics. I'd studied government at university. I used to get up every day and think there was nothing more exciting than going to Parliament House to cover these important, affairs of the nation. So I had a great job, but I got sick, and I wasn't particularly ill, but I had a bit of elective surgery. There was a bit of a loss of blood, and I got very run down, and I went back to work too early. And as a consequence of that, I ended up with heart palpitations, a very similar story, in fact, to Claire Weekes. And those heart palpitations frightened me. And I got more and more sort of disturbed by them. There was nothing wrong with my heart, same problem she had. No one could find a reason for them. And anyway, in the end, I sort of ended up feeling incredibly unlike myself, very stressed out, very, very unhappy, more and more easily distressed. And I couldn't work out. I mean, it went on for quite a while. And then one day I, as I say, serendipitously came across her book. And it was revelation. And I thought, oh my God, this is extraordinary. This is, as so many people say, this is all about me. She may as well have been talking to me. I've heard people say that time and time again. And I mean, I wasn't on every page by any stretch of the imagination, but you know, she was able to explain to me what had happened to me that was so bewildering to me. And so I was just hugely grateful. And when I stopped working, I decided to step away from the Financial Review when I turned 60. And I wanted to spend a bit more time doing my own work and my own writing. I was thinking about what I'd like to do. And I suddenly thought, I wonder if there's been a biography written of this woman. And I thought there must have been, because I thought she was so clever and brilliant. And I just knew intuitively if she'd helped me, I'm sure she'd be helpful to other people. And then I found out, guess what? No one had written about her. So as a journalist, I'd looked at those words and thought, wow, how few people can use words to such good effect. And over the years, I watched lots of people as an editor who struggled with words, and the power of that writing really stayed with me. So that, in short, is why I decided a biography of Claire Weekes would be an excellent idea.
Well, I mean, it's a remarkable achievement. So there's a lot of things to say about that. But one of the things that I'm perhaps I shouldn't be surprised, but I am, that here is this woman who wrote a book, a really, what some people have described as a seminal text that was published in 1962, that has helped tens of millions of people, and yet we've never heard of her. So can you tell us a little bit about why you think that is?
I think it's a constellation of reasons. I don't think it's just one reason. Often people like to say it was because she was maybe an older woman or a woman. And yes, you know, that may be true. I think also she wasn't one of them. She was outside the psychiatric and psychological sphere. She was a medical doctor. And they all live in such silos, and they all, you know, you're either one of them or you're not, and therefore you're disqualified in a sense. Which, but on top of that, she wrote self-help, and I think that for that world of academic and clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, what is self-help in 1962? It's a popular brand that you can completely afford to ignore. However, what they overlooked was that she had a doctorate in science. So she was a scientist before she was a doctor, and she had an international reputation in evolutionary biology. So she was, and then she got a medical degree. So she was incredibly credentialed. She wasn't a populist or a slight writer. She was a really, really educated woman, but she wasn't educated in their field. So I think the combination of, you know, this outsider, this older woman who's an outsider to them, their field, they didn't understand about her academic background, and they probably wouldn't have cared. They would have thought, well, she doesn't understand psychiatry and psychology. So, and she writes self-help. So I think for that constellation of reasons, she got ignored. And she was very popular with the press. They may have been jealous of that, but I don't think it impressed. They just put that down to populism as well.
It seems to me this is still an issue in our era, that this is still something that happens when someone comes up with something that works. It can be so easily dismissed by those in the professions. But you say in your book that Weekes completely changed the trajectory of treatment of severe anxiety states. What did she actually do that did this?
Well, I think what she did was set in the context of a time when there was a lot, either anxiety wasn't treated at all, or if it was, they were Freudian type psychoanalysis. I think she explained it through the way the nervous system worked, and she was able to get very simple ways to sort of reduce your emotional distress. And in doing so, she took a very different approach. It wasn't a sort of, the prevailing approaches where you sat down, had psychoanalysis, you took a drug, you rearranged your thoughts and thought more positively, you had cognitive approaches about, and she said, look, actually, it's simpler than that. She was basically saying, you have to feel the fear. You have to go with the fear. And her great, brilliant, simple idea was acceptance, and accept the fear. And that was to invoke your body to start lowering its temperature, so to speak, lowering its excitation levels, and bring you back to a sort of a peace. Now, that simple idea of acceptance is now ubiquitous everywhere. It's the acceptance therapy is the third wave, so-called, of cognitive behavioural therapy. You'll find it in pain science. You know, the Buddhists liked it, for example. They thought of it before she did, by the way. And, you know, so that simple idea, which has a basis in body science, in understanding how the body works, because if you fight fear, you make it worse. So that really simple idea is so much at the heart of contemporary psychological approaches to people. No one would say, pull up your socks, go and fight your fear these days. They would tell you to so-called exposure therapy, where people are exposed to their fears. Now, she wouldn't go out and send you to, you know, out to sort of let the dragon breathe over you. She wasn't just someone who said, oh, just go out and face it. But she introduced you to the idea that the problem wasn't outside you, it was inside you. That wasn't actually the dragon you were worried about. It was the feelings you got inside you when you thought of a dragon, or you thought of if you're frightened of going outside. So it was that idea of acceptance, and it was that idea that the problem is inside you, not outside you. Whatever you think you're frightened of, it's actually yourself you're frightened of.
One of the things that this is so beautifully explained in your book, and one that really resonated with me, was this thing about that fear cannot be extinguished by the rational brain. So there's this sort of gap between the emotional self and the logical self, and that feelings actually tend to trump the intellect. If you're someone who's suffering, agoraphobia was something that she particularly helped people with. In terms of, I think, understanding that it wasn't actually the fear of going outside, it was the fear of being afraid of going outside. That's what you're talking about, this inner fear.
Well, that's right, because what she realised was that, and what we all understand, is when you feel fear, the word feel carries the meaning here. It's not a thought fear, it's a felt fear. So when you feel fear, and we can get to that later, her first and second fear and the way in which they conspire, the way fear works in the brain. But fear is a felt thing. And if it starts to feel overwhelming, what you're really frightened of is that feeling. So even though you think it's that you don't like going outside, it's not the outside world. It's when you anticipate going outside, your body is invaded by this dread and these terrible sensations. Your heart races, you might sweat, you might get weak-kneed, but you will have all of these body sensations that accompany the fear. It's not just an isolated thought that randomly sits up there in abstract. So she understood the visceral nature of fear, and that's what people were frightened of. It wasn't really that they were frightened of the marketplace or going out into the world or the spider. I mean, obviously we're frightened of spiders, but if you can't look at a picture of a spider on the page, that's, there's nothing particularly rational about that, but the fear is overwhelming. So that's what you're dealing with, not trying to explain to someone that it's silly to be frightened of a spider when all they know is when they see that spider, they get these terrible feelings. So you have to address those terrible feelings, not the picture of the spider.
Now, this actually came out of her own personal experience as a young woman. She was this very brilliant woman. She got into science. She did a doctorate and then went on to later do her medical degree. But quite early on, she was misdiagnosed, and she ended up being told she had tuberculosis and went off to a sanatorium for 6 months. But in fact, she was, saved in a way by this friend of hers, Marcel Rousseau, who actually was able to explain to her that what she was feeling was a legitimate thing. Can you tell us a little bit about what was this vital springboard? And I guess it was a combination of not only her own personal experience and then her later understanding of it, but then this extraordinary ability she obviously had to be able to communicate these ideas to the broader public in such a way that they were able to absorb.
That's the whole sort of, in a way, what you're capturing is the that's the broad thread of the book, which is she suffers herself. She's frightened of her racing heart. That initial fear, why is my heart racing? I'm having a heart attack. That frightens her. And she becomes what she would later call sensitized. And that means she's constantly living hypervigilantly, living in a very alarmed state. And that then further alarms her. She starts to frighten herself. Why am I constantly feeling alarmed? And because she doesn't understand this, she stays in this permanent state of completely stressed out. And it was when she gets to London, after 2 years of this suffering, writing her doctorate, but feeling she's having a nervous breakdown, she finally admits that to him, that she's feeling dreadful. And he said, well, what's wrong? And she said, I've got this racing heart and have these terrible thoughts, and, and I don't know who I am anymore, and I can't recognize this distressed, crazy individual, or whatever, a version of whatever she says to him. And he said, oh, that's nothing. That happened to soldiers in World War I. He said, you're just frightened. That's just fear. And she said, oh, you mean I've been frightening myself? He said, absolutely. He said, what you have to do is just float past them. Don't fight it. Just float past all those thoughts, and now you'll calm down. It was sort of that simple. And she went, oh, I'd seen doctors. She'd seen doctors. No one had explained that fear could have this absolutely devastating effect on the body. And I'm sure everyone listening here will have their own pet, I feel like I'm going to faint, or, they perspire too much. The body will collaborate to express fear in your body. And if you're particularly fearful, it will be an absolute orchestra of bodily symptoms. So anyway, so he explains all this to her. She gets the idea that she's frightening herself. And then she decides she'll just sleep through the heart palpitations, because she wasn't getting any sleep at that stage. And she'd just go with it. And eventually they disappeared. And she was very, very pleased about that. But then the story becomes, how does she then piece together what happened to her and what she was told by Marcel? The simple idea of that's what happens to soldiers. They get fear of fear, essentially, and the battle's over, but their heart's still racing, and all these terrible feelings are in their body. Why is that so? So she gets that idea, but then she studies the nervous system. She then becomes a doctor. And that's where she sees more anxious people, and she specializes in helping them, because she wasn't helped by doctors whom she found completely useless at the time to explain. So she then extends her understanding of the different ways people suffer from anxiety. And then finally, when she decides to write the book, she has this rich experience, personal and professional, scientific, because she studied evolutionary biology, so she knows all about primal fight or flight, and how every animal, fear is a primal emotion. She knew all of that stuff. She knows all about how it manifests in different ways in her patients, so she can see its different manifestations, and she's worked out a way to help her patients. So I guess the mystery is, and the brilliance is, the way in which she wrote such a simple book that could speak to so many people. And that goes, I suppose I could then speak about the Weeks who had the gift of the gab. And it was a family that knew how to communicate.
Yes, yes. Well, her brother wrote the Vegemite song.
Her brother wrote the Vegemite song, that's right.
Just love. Happy little
along with Louis the Fly, and install.
He wrote Louis the Fly as well. Oh, how wonderful.
Louis the Fly too.
An extraordinary family. Later in the book, you do say this wonderful quote: simplicity is one of the most difficult things to achieve. So I think that the book that she wrote in 1962, Self-Help for the Nerves, which is still selling, and I'm still seeing online people raving about it and telling, writing comments that saved their life and it's the best book they've ever read and that sort of thing. Quite an incredible achievement. But she herself was very unusual in that she went so far above and beyond to actually help her patients, help people with anxiety. Can you tell us a bit about that? Phone calls and staying?
Well, that's right. Well, I think that's because it goes back to when she had heart palpitations. She goes into a sanitarium because they think she's got TB. She's been wrongly diagnosed. She's got this racing heart no one can explain. And when she comes out, she stays with a friend whose husband's a doctor. And she wakes up in the middle of the night, as she was wont to, with the heart racing, and she calls her friend and says, I think I'm dying. Can you please get your husband? And the friend came back and said, no, he wouldn't come to see her because she would think she was worse than she really was. So he wasn't going to come. So she had that. First of all, she had doctors unable to explain the racing heart to her. Then she had a doctor who refused to, who must have intuited that she was just, getting overexcited and frightening herself. But he didn't come and say, look, you're getting frightened, and fear is programming your nervous system. It's in charge of you now, and that's why you're feeling this way. And she felt very, very strongly that because no doctor had ever explained that to her, she, I think, had a passion for the sort of what she knew when it was finally explained to her, how hugely helpful that was, that I think she took into the surgery a passion for helping people with anxiety. So it was really deeply felt. And eventually, because she was able to explain it to them so well, she saw the gratitude that she got, enormous gratitude, which then reinforced her certainty that she was onto something that she could see none of her other doctor peers, let alone the psychiatrists and the psychologists, even her peers didn't seem to have success. They'd have the gastroenterology patient who was never cured, or the person with, lung issues that never seemed to get, their breathing never seemed to get better, but they couldn't find anything wrong with them. And she knew what was wrong with them because she knew the mind-body connection. By now, she'd perfected that through her science and her medicine and her personal experience and her patients. She learned from all of those things how to explain to people. I think I've lost a bit of the drift of your question at the end.
No, you're right. It's just that I was fascinated by the fact that she would take phone calls from people.
Oh, yeah, well, that again, yes, exactly.
Have patients stay with her.
Oh, yeah, look, she crossed all the boundaries she would never cross today, but it was a passion. And she used to say to her niece, Tita, who would pull out, that she had a very feisty niece who was always pulling the plug out of the phone, because she said, you've got to stop it, you've got to stop these phone calls now. But she used to say, I can't, because you don't know where they are. And what she meant by that, they may need help right now. What she understood was that people could feel suicidal. I mean, they may not have committed suicide, but she was aware that even if they didn't, they felt so bad. She knew from personal experience how low you could go, and yet in lots of ways how simple the problem is. Not easy necessarily, but it's a sort of a simple problem, and if people could be given help, she was there to help them. I think she just felt that absolutely passionately after her own experience.
She really was extraordinary. But the book itself is extraordinary too, because the breadth and scope of the book is quite remarkable. And I would love you to talk a little bit about your own research and how you went about structuring, because the book goes, we get discussions of Charles Darwin and the Voyage of the Beagle, we get Freud, we have to understand about that, we have to understand the state of psychoanalysis and psychology in that era, because it was very different in the 1950s and 60s from what it is now. There's just so many, and then of course there's her great friend Elizabeth Coleman, so there's the musical side, there's her family, so there's all these areas that you have clearly had to delve deeply into, I think, and read widely, and then you've done this beautiful job of weaving it all together into this very compelling, very readable account of this remarkable woman, who deserves a lot of recognition than she got.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I did weave it together, because that was a huge challenge. And it's lovely to hear you say that, Jen, because as you can see, what I was trying to do was not only tell the story of her life and her work and why her work was successful, but explain why her work ended up where it ended up and where it sat within the arc of treatment and of evolution of ideas in this field over the centuries. So it's really 100 years. I've tried to sort of pot a bit of 100 years of treatment in there as well. Now, I'm a journalist. I'm not a medical doctor or a shrink or anything. So it was mainly a joy for me to research it. But of course, I found, she's born in 1900 and she's a biologist. So you're taken into that world, and she's studying Darwin, and I'm taken into that world because she's studying evolutionary biology. I find out that Darwin has written a book on the emotions, and why? Because he too had racing heart, a very, very nervous disposition. So that was absolutely fascinating. And then I tracked sort of the early history, and I found that a lot of the scholars of the 19th century looked at the mind-body connection and the relationship between the mind and the body and took a sort of slightly biological approach. And then suddenly Freud cropped up, and he was a biologist too, but he decided he'd be a Darwin of the psyche, that he would delve into the mysterious oceans of the psyche. So he stepped away from what was called somatization, the way in which the mind and the body work together somatically, and stepped into the whole psychic, the whole idea of the unconscious and the ego and the id and early sexual development and Oedipal complex. It was a very complicated thing which puts sex at the center of the problem, childhood sexuality and relationships with parents and so on. And this whole very unprovable in a way. And she looked at all of that and thought, well, it's all very well. And maybe a parent didn't love you enough, or, you could go back into his idea of psychoanalyzing people, but it didn't solve their problem. They still went to that front door every morning, and even though they knew their parents hadn't loved them enough, or maybe they wanted to kill their mother or whatever they wanted to do, but in the Freudian terms, it didn't help the problem right now. And the problem was they were very frightened. So it was just following that arc of how she and how Freud, in fact, took psychology down this psychoanalytical route and away from the biological approach. And so then you ended up with, and then you had the drug people who thought drugs would be the problem, very biologically, just treat it with the drug. And she didn't like that much at all. And then you had the cognitive behavioural people, and who thought you change behaviour or you change the way you think. They're mainly psychologists. So, you had to sort of work out where she fitted in that. And I think she started with that mind-body stuff that came from the 19th century and got waylaid by Freud, who then subsequently has been waylaid a bit himself by more of the mind-body stuff now.
Yes, well, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing we've moved on from Freud.
Well, interestingly too, he didn't treat the soldiers in World War I. He kept his private patients, treating them at the time, and she, I think what was interesting is she discerned that fear was a much greater driver of distress than sex was, whereas he put sex and sexuality in this prime position. And the World War I didn't change his view because he didn't treat the soldiers, but a lot of the doctors who did treat those soldiers, including people who taught her, understood that men became deranged by fear. If you've been buried half alive in a trench, your nervous system's not going to be in a really good shape. So it really wasn't much to do with your early childhood.
No, well, she worked with Sir Grafton Elliott Smith, who wrote that book about what is now called post-traumatic stress disorder, but then was Shellshock, in 1917, which didn't get any real attention, but actually in some ways I think sort of is one of the early texts along the lines of what Claire Weekes eventually developed. Would you agree with that? I mean, he was obviously a very important influence, I think.
Well, he was, and I've had to make assumptions there, but I can't tell you the excitement I felt when I thought, oh, okay, here's her teacher. He taught her about, he was an expert on the brain. And he was in London at University College teaching there in the early 30s when she was there. And he taught her about the nervous system. She did a course with him. She chose to. This is just after she understands that what's wrong with her is fear. So she gets very interested in the nervous system. And then I suddenly found he's written this book called Shellshock and its lessons in 1917. And my excitement when I picked up this short pamphlet was profound, because he's a very direct speaking Australian, and his discussion of men who are captured by fear itself, he explained a lot of that, not in the way she did at all. So there was no sense of plagiarism, but he wrote in this very direct way for the general public, trying to explain that shell-shocked men were not malingerers or they weren't cowards. They were people who'd had these appalling things happen to them, and fear had done this to them. And he also said these are illnesses of civil life before and after the war, they're not just wartime ills. So he gave her a context with that short pamphlet, Shellshock and Its Lessons, which in its own way, I think has never been given the credit it deserves for this very, very forward-looking pamphlet that anticipated what we now call post-traumatic shock disorder, which became a thing in not until 1980 did they really recognise that soldiers, were traumatized. It was sort of pushed away. It was too costly. So he wrote this back in 1917, another Australian who could see that after the war, people needed to care for these soldiers. They shouldn't just be tossed on the heap or discharged or whatever. So all of those were great discoveries, I found, to just find those links. And then I'm assuming she's read it. I don't know that she has, but when I read it, to me, it was just obvious she had.
It does make sense, I have to say. I do love this quote where you say, she believed, a certain amount of suffering is good for us, particularly when young. We should not be sheltered too much. The experience you gain from your present suffering can be your staff in years to come. I think that is so relevant to today's world, and the fact that in some ways we try to avoid all kinds of suffering and have our children avoid it, but perhaps that isn't. Claire Weeks seems to have been really well ahead of her time in the 50s and 60s.
Well, she does. And a lot of it, and the thing is, a lot of it sounds just like common sense, but when she can explain it in terms of I hope I'm not losing people here, the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, the arousal system, and the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest. So she can put common sense in a body medical science context. So behind that common sense, there's a really good and quite profound point about how you bring your nervous system into a state of peace. And one of the things that always amused me was that she would say things like, that with children, if, for example, Christmas is coming, don't say it's only, you've got 5 days until Christmas. She'd say things like, you've got 5 days until Christmas, which means you've got plenty of time to go and do other things and think about something else. She was almost trying to train people's nervous systems not to be overreactive, not to over-respond, realising that learning to keep a bit grounded was something that was important to practice over and over again. And I think that's why her books were so useful, because people could go back to them and be reminded yet again of taking a step back from the panic, taking a step back from the anxiety, and allowing their nervous systems to release.
I mean, there's so much in the book that really resonates, as I've said, particularly at the moment, I think, with a lot of us, struggling with lockdown and different sorts of stresses and anxieties. But one of the things I'd like you to talk to us a little bit too about is her personal life. So she had this fascinating family, but she also had this remarkably close friendship with Elizabeth Coleman, who was a very well-known, very proficient concert pianist, and highly regarded. And I'm interested in this relationship. Obviously, they lived together, they shared a life together. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, well, the family describes them as soulmates. It was clearly a profound relationship. And one of her nieces said, look, if only we could all have relationships that were as meaningful as this relationship was to these two women. And I think, again, as I found writing the book a bit like being a sort of solving a puzzle. It was fascinating. What are the bits? How do I put this puzzle together to see the whole picture? And one ingredient, apart from the ones I've talked about, one ingredient in that picture that's so important is Beth Coleman. And first of all, she met her when she was tired of researching lizards and laboratories, and she was sort of between worlds, really. She wanted to get out of that, and she decided to take up singing part-time. And her accompanist was a teacher at the conservatorium called Beth Coleman, who was about 4 years older than her. And then at that point, they obviously just became so attached to each other, and they went overseas and so on. But what became clear to me was that Beth herself was a gifted counsellor. And I think Claire probably learned an awful lot from Beth, who was obviously a very calm, very steady personality. I mean, as was Claire, but I think Claire was probably more, you know, a much more revved up sort of individual. And I think that that's possibly the wrong way of putting it. But I think Beth not only was a hugely steady influence on Claire, she taught Claire things about how to live that I think were lessons that Claire was able to pass on to others. And she always said, even with her books being so helpful to people, that you should always find one person. It's always useful to have one person that you profoundly trust, that you can talk things over with. So she had no problem whatsoever with people seeking quality advice or having good advisors. She was just very worried that they might choose a religious advisor who'd make their burden of guilt even heavier, or the wrong psychiatrist who'd take them down some nutty path too, which she saw often enough. So I think Beth was hugely she just fed through Claire's work in a rather invisible but profound way because of her own approach to life.
Obviously a very intelligent woman, one thinks.
Yes, yes.
So you do observe that to be as good as she was required, this is Claire Weeks, to be as good as she was required drive and self-possession, if not obsession. Weeks could be autocratic and self-centered. And she was described by someone who knew her well as a very difficult woman. In what ways do you think?
Look, I think eventually she became very convinced that she was right and a lot of other people were wrong. I think she became, I mean, for all of her generosity, which was there, I think that ended up feeding the fact that she was doing something that other people were not. And that was both very gratifying, and her gratification married her sense that she was really right and other people didn't understand quite how right she was. So she felt she was on this crusade, and I think if people got in her way, or not got in her way is the wrong way to describe. The person who described her as a difficult woman was someone who wanted her to do something for him. So I probably should have put that in a bit better context. I think more she was difficult with her family sometimes because the family had to, her work came first over everything else, and she lived with her sister and her sister's children. And I think they all realised that, you know, they were all brought up to understand that their aunt's work took precedence over everything. So Claire just accepted that this preeminent position as the doctor, and then increasingly the famous individual that the press will always ring up, the woman who travelled around the world, who was famous around the world. And, you know, I think people, and she never cooked or bottle washed or did any home chores. So everyone waited on Claire, and yet she could be incredibly generous. She supported her family. They will tell you individual stories of her generosity, but she was the dame, you know. So, and that came, I think, as the years went on, where, you know, she assumed certain, she just assumed her position in a way.
Well, some people actually call her a genius. And certainly the fact that the book still nearly 50 years, well, 60 years later, is still selling in the millions, is Self-Help for the Nerves, which isn't the only book she wrote, but she does seem to have been a pioneer. Now, she certainly doesn't seem to have had, apart from some popular press in the Women's Weekly and the Sydney Press, she doesn't ever seem to have had really any kind of formal recognition. I think she was meant to get an OAM, but she died. And then what about the Nobel Prize? Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Well, yes. Well, that was Robert DuPont, a psychiatrist in America, who set up the first big anxiety disorders association in America, inspired by her work. She helped him solve the problem of his anxious young daughter. And he was a trained Freudian psychoanalyst. And I mean, he was completely, felt he had no tools to help his own child. And she helped him. And that sort of, he just thought she was a genius because she made what was a really complicated problem simple. And in the end, it was Robert DuPont and a couple of her patients who collected a whole lot of people, including our own Gavin Andrews here in Australia, who's set up an anxiety clinic and very well known in the field. So they got lots of people together, but Bob DuPont at the time said, look, I always knew it would be a very difficult mission because you needed a very deep research background. And again, people who write self-help don't win Nobel Prizes, prizes, even if they're based on immense science and medicine, which, I hoped in the book to try and show in as least boring a way possible, is that it sits on scholarship, even though it's not scholarship. And I think that was always going to be a road too far for the Nobel Prize people, but the Nobel Committee. But she certainly would have got an Order of Australia in the end, but sadly she died just as they were drawing up the paperwork for that.
Very unfortunate. But it is still surprising, the lack of recognition, the fact that her name, I don't think, is well known to people other than those who've read and benefited from her books. And I still find that even her own school, Sydney Girls High, when they had their celebrations in 2013, didn't seem to understand who Claire Weekes was or had become.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And I think, I think it still remains the case. I think my book's probably gone some way to, a small way towards letting people in this. But the fact remains that her country still does not recognise that she filled in some missing pieces in the evolving understanding of nervous disorders. There'd be many psychiatrists and psychologists who don't know that they're leaning on her when they talk about fight and flight and your nervous system and the way you've got to accept and exposure therapy and go in with the fear, not fight. All of this stuff, she and her idea of first and second fear is completely state of the art. That means that's basically the startle fear that you get that you can't control, and then there's the thinking fear. What was that? Was that dangerous? She's got the two fears. Now that's very neuroscientifically state of the art. But again, I still think people, it's the self-help part of it. I still think, even though they rest on a lot of her work, I still don't think people completely get it. But, individuals do, because they're everywhere. There's an invisible footprint of Claire Weekes all over the world with people. I mean, I was just contacted the other day by a man from Florida who was telling me, I wanted to tell me his story, another one back in his 20s, saved my life, blah, blah. I hear that so often. So she's got this huge invisible footprint, but, and her work supports a lot of state-of-the-art work, but yeah, no plaque, no building named after her, no song.
Quite extraordinary. You do say towards the end, it actually did take professionals decades to agree about Weekes' approach, and clearly this is something that's become much more mainstream than it was when she was publishing her books. But many didn't, and some still don't agree with her approach. Is that a common thing, do you think? Do you get...
Well, I guess it depends. There's just so many different schools. The thing about Claire is she joined a lot of dots. I mean, if you go and look at psychiatry and psychology, it's very confusing because there are all these acronyms, there are all these different, there's CBT, behaviour therapy, psychoanalysis, drugs, and there's all sorts of different acronyms, ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. There's something called, I can't remember them all. There's eye movement desensitivity, something or other. I mean, look, there's thousands of these different, I haven't looked at them in any detail, but I know, and the problem is none of them can agree on the basic foundations of treatment, and that's an issue within the profession itself. I mean, she, for example, had one thing in common with Freud. She saw anxiety as a broad thing. She didn't chop it up into little disorders like social anxiety disorder or agoraphobia. I mean, she did that a little bit because she had to write a book on it, but that was a book publisher's idea. But basically, she saw fear as the common thread underneath a lot of disorders that are now chopped up into different segments and treated differently, as if and she'd say, no, there's a common thread. It's called fear sitting underneath all of them. They just manifest themselves differently. So I think you'll find there's such fragmentation and lack of agreement on first principles that is just a huge problem in the whole treatment of what we call either mental health or mental illness, depending on what your preferences are. So it's that issue of what is the agreed basis for treatment? Well, the answer is there's very little. They're all some people swear by drugs. Other people will be tearing drugs down and saying you can't do drugs. Some people say you've got to have years of psychotherapy. Other people say, but there's very little agreement. And into that sort of vacuum come these simple books that speak to people still very effectively.
Well, perhaps that's why, because she cuts through. I mean, you do say individuals who read her books or who listen to her audios would be overwhelmed with gratitude. So I think that speaks volumes, but professionals often responded with indifference or worse. So I think it's that disjunct between those, you know, ordinary mortals who are actually benefiting enormously from the work that she did, from her extraordinary insights and her ability to communicate with such simplicity and precision, and actually give them a path to overcoming their anxieties or depression or agoraphobia or whatever their mental health problem was. And those in the professions who didn't want someone they perceived her to be, which I actually think is wrong. I think their perception was often incorrect because of the self-help element. You know, you get people who just have an instantaneous rejection or resentment of her success. But
yeah, that's right. Well, also, I wondered too, I think what she appreciated was that quite normal and often quite nice people can feel completely unhinged by anxiety and unhinged, and they're not actually unhinged. And something inside them knows they're not unhinged, but they feel unhinged. And she knew, because she'd been through it, that a clever woman who went on to have had a you know, great, in lots of ways, quite a good family, and went on to have a great life, could end up feeling she was half bonkers. And so she could talk to the reader and say, I know you are feeling as bad as this and you think you're like this, but actually just sit back and I'll tell you why you think like this and why it's not as bad as you think, and that there's a very simple explanation for all of this. Now, the cure is simple. It's not necessarily easy, but I promise you, you will get better. And you are just, you know, you're not some person with personality disorders or, you know, some big problems. You are just frightened. And this is, now, I just think that simple message, probably a lot of people today who are psychologists and psychiatrists probably don't explain well enough to their own patients, because they haven't probably felt it themselves in the way she did. And because she'd spoken to all these patients over the years, she knew what they felt inside and how to tell their story to them. Whereas probably when people see a lot of psychiatrists, they feel misunderstood or not really, people don't realize quite how distressed they actually are, because people don't go into probably a lot of places and say, look, I feel completely because so in a way, I think that this huge quiet market of intense suffering, she just was able to speak directly to, in a way that they went, my God, I've seen all these other people, or I've never been able to find anyone who could see me, who could see my suffering, and then explain it all so confidently and in such a way that I really understand it. And I feel profoundly relieved by understanding it. So I think that plays into it as well.
That is a very common theme, this idea that people would pick up her book and then say, if it was as if she was describing me, as if she was speaking directly to me. Yes. And that's one of the things that really came out was this sense of, gosh, anxiety, depression, all these mental health are just so common. It's not some unusual story to tell, and it happens to so many people, most people probably. But one of the things I absolutely love about her is that in the book, Self-Help for the Nerves, she says in block capitals, the advice given here will definitely cure you. And I just think, well, you could do that in the 60s. You probably couldn't do that now. But isn't it marvellous that she did it?
Well, it is marvellous. And with the photo of the doctor on the back, you know, and the pearls and the twin set, you know, I mean, it lent an authority to her voice, you know. And I remember being relieved when I read it. And I thought, oh, you know, but it can sound a bit cultish, but, you know, so she's running some cult, you know, I'll cure you and woohoo, you know, but it's not that at all. She's just saying, look, let me explain the way the mind and body work, and you can get, and it's so practical, and it's such common sense. And again, I think people probably, it's not as though some people, it was a magic wand. They went, oh, I get it. And they were cured, particularly if panic disorder, you know, they went, oh, okay, I get that. Now, it's not going to be like, mean that no one's ever going to be anxious again. And probably the value of the book too is people can go back and remind themselves again and again, so they learn how to manage themselves. And I think she understood the brain so well. She knew, as she said, if you step off the footpath in the same spot every day, you're going to wear a path. And that's what your brain does when you think the same thoughts and you react the same way. So she knew people had to practice floating, acceptance. That had to be practiced for some people. Yes, there were instant miracle cures. There were, and I know that. But for a lot of people, it was practice, and they had a little toolkit that they always had that meant that the places might be dark and scary, but they weren't completely pitch black. There was a little bit of light they could see, and they could get to the end of that tunnel should they enter that tunnel again. And I also think, if I can just add this, I think her understanding of depression was profound. She called it depletion, and she realised well before a lot of other people, well before anyone else, that their comorbidities, which is the parlance people use, depression and anxiety are like terrible twins often. And the reason people get depressed is they've spent their so long being anxious, their system is adrenalized, the fear adrenaline fear cycle is so unrelenting that they get what she calls depleted. Now, isn't that an easier way to understand depression? Isn't that a fresh way to understand depression, rather than, and with its positive sense of repletion rather than just depression, you know?
Absolutely. I think that's brilliant. And on that, I have a question, if I can just pull it up. Here it is, from one of our attendees. Did she consider whether anxiety and or fear might be passed down through families?
Look, she did, and she addressed that directly. And she just said, look, a lot too much is made of the hereditary side. She said, if you live with someone who's very gloomy, you're going to pick up on that. So she was more or less making a plug a bit for nurture as well as nature. I don't think she was fond of the idea that people had some hereditary bone pointed at them, because she liked the idea, and she'd experienced the idea, that you could change your own way of being in the world, that it was possible to, you weren't fated because of your genetic destiny. She specially addressed that and said, you know, if you live with someone who's depressed, for you know, that's easy enough to pick that up, rather than it just be a genetic destiny.
Right. We also had a couple of questions from one of our attendees, Leslie, and I'll just read them. What are the implications for people who are diagnosed as highly sensitive people, HSPs? Does this add another level of pressure or anxiety for people dealing with depression or anxiety?
Well, I have to just say, first of all, I'm not a doctor. I can't really answer, and I can't answer for her. I can only sort of wildly speculate, which may not be very useful to Leslie. But I'm also not aware of, what is that category, highly sensitive people?
Yes, I don't know.
I have to say, because I'm not in that field, I've not actually heard that as being used, and whether that would in fact, I mean, she didn't like labels at all. Let's put it this way. I know that what she didn't like was putting labels on people. She didn't think they were at all useful, and they tended to just further frighten and alarm people and pathologize something she was very keen to explain was something that could be unpacked and unraveled. It wasn't a destiny of a label that was slammed on you that you couldn't shift, you know. So yeah. That's the way I would answer that.
Okay, and the second question then was, do people dealing with depression and or anxiety tend to have a heightened reaction to events in life such as grief, personal trauma, which then might trigger to catastrophizing, than people who do not suffer from depression and or anxiety? So do those heighten our responses, do you think, or our feelings?
Well, it's a bit chicken and egg, isn't it? I mean, I think the way I would answer this is, I'd say she says the big culprits are sensitization, bewilderment, and fear, and they're the three big things. And she had learned, as I did, through being run down, and you know, she too had lost blood in some operation, I think, I can't remember the details now, but on tonsils, I think. But she had learned that people get sensitized, and often through illness, but it can be through a terrible problem, a shame, a guilt, a loss, a grief maybe. But so you can have something physical or perhaps some terrible emotional burden. And she said that can sensitize people. And once sensitized, that's where the problem starts. And she always felt that people concentrated so much on desensitizing people, where she said the way you did that was by accepting all of the horrible feelings. That's the way you desensitized. You could do it yourself by accepting all the terrible feelings. But she said medical people didn't understand enough about sensitization and how and why people got sensitized in the first place, which makes them vulnerable to that idea of catastrophizing, living on their nerves, whatever you might call it, overreacting. And she did see that when you're in that state, joyous things seem more joyous, sad things seem more tragic. Everything is experienced in the extreme. And she was trying to bring people down from that. And look, maybe some people certainly do have a tendency to be more like that than others. But does that really matter? Until it becomes a problem. If it becomes a problem, what she'd say is, I've got the solution. You've got to learn to accept. And it's, so yeah, that's what I would say.
And a question again from another attendee. Did she ever consider or work with Carl Jung's theories?
Not that I'm aware. I think, again, she would regard that as overcomplex. She might have been interested in him, I don't know. But I think she didn't. She read lots of medical texts. She didn't read lots of psychological texts or psychiatric texts at all. I think she thought she was better than all of them, and she had literally cracked the code, and they were all off on some crazy frolic all of their own.
Sort of making it far more complicated than she felt it needed to be.
Far more complicated than it needed to be. That's not to say I don't think that she understood that there were some psychoses. I think there was a huge she mentally could put those in one category. But for common garden anxiety and depression, and mainly anxiety, she didn't sort of pathologize those or make them more complicated than they needed to be, I don't think. And she didn't want people to overcomplicate them.
It seems to me that, in fact, you just said, common and garden anxiety and possibly depression are actually part of the normal human condition. That most humans experience these things at some time or other in their lives, and you need to find a way through, which is something that she obviously did.
Well, that's right. And I think it's important that people not feel just because they've got that. And might think I shouldn't speak for myself, although I do think it's important. I think she would think it's important that people not see themselves as abnormal. It's not, there's not a label. And she said, I'm not talking about people with personality disorders or things like that. These are very ordinary, in the best sense of ordinary, people. And they have to, and this is part of the human experience. And some people do suffer a bit more than others, but sometimes that's because, as she would put it, they have been tricked by their nerves. You have been tricked. And as long as you just go with it and walk on those jelly legs, they will carry you. Don't try and stop breathing if you think you can't breathe. See if you can stop breathing. You won't be able to. She was able to say, look, you can keep functioning even when you think you can't. You can manage, she wasn't forcing people to do that, but she was explaining that as long as you just impute everything, if you think you're going to faint, you won't faint, you'll fear it, but it's the fear, not the fainting, that's the problem, and so on. So she was eager, I think, just to explain to people that, a lot about them was just extremely normal and very simply explained.
Well, she certainly seems to have done a great service to humankind, which, isn't always all that common. And she was an Australian, which is something we should, I think, all be very proud of. I have a comment here from Michael. As a 25-year mental health nurse, reading about Claire and her work was refreshing and simplistic in a field that is at best can be very complicated and confusing for clients. Thanks for introducing her work to a new generation.
Oh, that's lovely. It's Michael, is it? Michael?
Yes, Michael.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Michael. I'm so delighted to hear that. I suppose my passion is that she was helpful to me, and I just think, people who are really helpful to lots of people are, should be celebrated, and the word should be passed on, in my opinion. So thank you.
Well, I think you've done a splendid job in bringing her into the public consciousness again, a woman who ought to be acknowledged and celebrated for her remarkable contribution to human health and mental health in particular, and to you, Judith. And I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'm sure there are, you know, lots more things that people would like to hear about, but I can just highly recommend that they read the book, because I found it eminently readable and fascinating, and just such a wonderful insight into this extraordinary woman. So thank you.
Thank you. And Jen, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I really appreciate it. And thanks to the library too.
Yes, well, thank you, Judith, for a great discussion. And of course, The Woman Who Cracked the Anxiety Code is available to borrow from the Geelong Regional Libraries in hard copy and ebook format. And you can get your copy without all the tabs that are in mine.
I love that. I'm very impressed with that.
So thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And everyone stay well and safe. And on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library, thank you all for joining us, and good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.